Oh, good morning, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are. Sorry that we're late. I'm just going to send out an email letting people know that we've gone live. So, CJ, if you want to start talking for a while.
Yeah, certainly. I'll just say briefly to everybody because I see some people in the live chat. So thank you all for being here and shalom. Um, Keith and Kevin so far. Appreciate you guys being here today. Got a very awesome conversation. I've been somewhat on a holiday kick now for like a month, and it's probably going to continue now for a while because um, a lot of people who do have the information that I have are not necessarily trustworthy in other places, and so yeah, we've been discussing, not me and Graham, but me and numerous brothers across the internet sphere have been talking about maybe it'd be a good idea to, rather than sending people to less than savory sources, maybe become the savory sources. So this may be a kick for quite some time for those of you who are interested in holiday study and why certain holidays are not pagan and all that other kind of stuff. Um, I
Yep.
actually, so go ahead.
No, yeah, you're right. Yeah, so that email's been sent out. So, I will put the StreamYard link in the chat as well if anybody would like to join us and comment as we're going, but we don't want to get too distracted on this one. I would think. There we go. So did you want to start with something or?
Well, I'll say a couple things real briefly. Um, First thing, just a quick shameless plug in case anyone's interested. I did do a video yesterday talking about why I think Jesus was actually born on December 25th, which is not the same topic as what we're talking about today, but it's very, very similar, of course. Um, and also a video before that, 2 days before that, talking about the holiday Epiphany, which may not mean much to Americans, but probably means a lot to a lot of people outside of the states. We don't tend to celebrate it too much in the states for some reason. Um, but nonetheless, if anybody's interested in those, definitely do consider checking them out. Um, the other thing I want to say here, real quick, is um, unfortunately, a lot of the source now, there's obviously a lot of sources that I'm going to have today, but just so you guys know, a lot of the sources that exist don't exist in English. So there is a good deal of for example, Methodius of Olympus has a sermon on come from about the year 312 that we won't be able to access today because it's all in Latin. Theophilus of Antioch has a document attributed to him that could date Christmas celebrations to as early as 170, but again, it is currently only in Latin. So note that when we go through this video, that the earliest sources I am able to provide are not the earliest sources that exist. And given a few months' time, and I'm actually in the process of finding a Latin translator as we speak, given a few months' time, we will have even better sources to share with you guys. But unfortunately, this research is being done as we speak, so we can't necessarily use some of those. But there are still a lot of good sources that have already been translated that we'll be using today. So I just wanted to let you guys know about that.
So yeah, we do want to show a lot of sources for these two issues, Christmas and Easter. I'm interested in talking with CJ about the evidence that he has that Jesus might have been actually born on the 25th of December. I haven't come across that myself. The evidence that I've come across proves that neither Christmas nor Easter was pagan, nor based on anything that was pagan. They were both created or the holidays were started on those dates because Christians believed that was that Jesus had died on the 25th of March, or what we would call the 25th of March. That's how it's come down to us, because calendars have changed and other things. But in the year that they believed that Jesus died, they believed that it was the 25th of March. So therefore, that's how we got Christmas. Now, it's interesting to me that there could be evidence that Jesus was actually born on the 25th of December. Maybe I should have done more research on this. So maybe we should start with talking about Easter first. And especially since, from a Christian point of view, the death of Jesus is more important than his birth. That's far more central to Christianity. So maybe let's talk about the word Easter first of all. So I don't know because CJ and I haven't really organized whether we agree on everything. So we haven't talked through all of these different issues that we could talk about. But there's the claim that Easter is based on paganism. It's the worship of Astarte or Istra, or one of these pagan goddesses of that sort of name. What my research has uncovered is that it's got nothing to do with any of that. And let's deal with this as well, that a lot of those claims come from Hislop and the book The Two Babylons. But that book produces almost no evidence for anything that he claims. He just says these things as though they're facts, with no evidence. And a lot of that claim that Hislop makes is based on claims made by the Venerable Bede, who was at least 1,000 years after Jesus was here on earth. And once again, no evidence. 1,000 years later, it was just invented, as far as we can tell, by the Venerable Bede, and then repeated by Hislop later, and others have picked it up as well. And it's just people believe it because it's been repeated so much. Oh, it must be true. There's so many sources that are claiming it. But if you go back to the original evidence, there's no evidence for all of these claims that Christmas and Easter are pagan. There's no original evidence. There's no early evidence for these things. So let's deal with this claim that Easter, the word Easter, is pagan. Feel free to jump in anytime, CJ, to comment on these things. My research shows that Easter comes from the same root as East. It's a German word meaning rising. So the rising of the sun is where we get the word East. And Easter comes from the same idea, but resurrection. And it still exists in that form in German today.
Yes, so it's an interesting one because there is a cognate of the word Easter that is actually the name of a pagan deity, but if you go far enough back in history, you will find that the word itself pre-exists the pagan deity, and in fact, the deity may not actually have existed. The aforementioned Bede is our one and only reference to this dawn goddess, this Germanic dawn goddess, whose name is Istore. And it is entirely possible that the Venerable Bede actually misinterpreted the information that he was given, because no other sources of Istore actually exist, which is quite something to think about, right? That we have tons of evidence of people interacting with Germanic pagan religion, but only one person in all throughout history has ever actually interacted with this particular deity, or worshipers of this deity, to be more precise. The full etymology, and which this would end up being the etymology, even if this goddess does exist, right? Because we do know that the etymology precedes the goddess, right? Or alleged goddess, I should be more clear. It originally comes from an old German word that is Istre, from the original Astron, and it means dawn or the rising. And so you can see why people would attribute this name to a holiday that references the rising. But it's actually a little bit deeper than that, only in this was already considered the name of the Germanic month, right? The month was known as Istran, and it was the month of rising, of course, right? This is when the plants start to bloom. It's when the day is really, really bright. All the different creatures are producing a lot. And so what ended up happening is this already existing holiday, which back then they called Pascha, which derives from the Hebrew Pesach, which you may know as Passover. They were calling it Pascha at that time, and then the Germanic peoples just decided, hey, we're going to start calling it Easter because that's the month we have it in. It's in the month of Easter, and it's the only holiday we have in that month. So, and also it happens to fit etymologically, right? It means rising, and this is what we're celebrating is the rising of Christ. Now, as far as our earliest reference to it being called Easter, meaning the holiday, that does appear to be relatively late, which does make sense. The Germanic peoples didn't convert to Christianity until relatively late. But it's still one that would predate the so-called Estore reference, which comes from, like I said, the Venerable Bede, and is a goddess that may not actually exist. And our earliest references to this holiday actually being referred to as Easter are going to come all the way back from the early 800s. And let me actually go ahead and pull up the source for you guys so you can see it for yourself. Then it would not, of course, be called Easter as we say today because English was not the language that they were speaking. The way you would actually say it in this language would be Ostern, which is Old German. And as you can see, there's so many different variations of this Ostern, Istre, Istron. It's because the Germanic languages spread all throughout very, very early on, right? Which should give you a little bit of a hint as to how old this word is, right? If it has an etymology that branches into all the different Germanic languages, then it would make sense that it would pop up in different variations in all of these different Germanic languages, like English and Northumbric and Norwegian and all that other kind of stuff. So let me go ahead and I'm going to pull up the date here. Just a moment. I just have to get off of the article that I was on there.
Paul Kamish says, my understanding is the Anglo-Saxons used the word Easter for the season, spring. English speakers eventually changed Easter.
Yeah, and my understanding, it was more the month, the main spring month, but the same general idea, yeah, where we this was just a word being used for this area of time, and then because it happened to etymologically fit with the holiday as well as the holiday being taking place on in this area of time, this ended up being the word that they adopted in English-speaking countries. Because recall, it was originally called Pascha, and in a lot of countries throughout the world, it to this day is still called Pascha or some variant of that. And sorry, it's...
And we do retain that idea. So there are people that call it the Passion or the Passion Week. That is still within English in various ways. It's not common, but you will encounter it. The death and resurrection of Jesus, and that whole week leading up to that, from the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem, that whole week to his resurrection, is referred to as the Passion Week.
All right, and then so I got the quote here now. So it is a quote from Bede. So you may be wondering, why did I say that this is predating Bede? Well, because Bede is actually referencing a pre-existing etymology here, and it actually happens to be the same quote where he talks about Estore. So this is going to be pretty useful for us. He says, Esturmanoth has a name which is now translated as the Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Estre, in whose honor feasts are celebrated in that month. Now they designate that Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance. So what's important to note here is this is the earliest reference we have to the word Easter being used to celebrate this feast. But the quote very clearly demonstrates that the people who Bede is speaking to have been using this word Easter for quite some time. Now, obviously, there's some misinformation in here, as we've already talked about. It's very likely that Estre doesn't even exist, and that he just he got some kind of a miscommunication here as far as identifying this goddess. But the miscommunication wouldn't be possible if the people that he was speaking to, the Anglo-Saxon people he was speaking to, were not actually using this word Estre to, or actually at this point it would be Astron, but nonetheless, to actually identify the Paschal season, as he indeed says himself, right? And so this is the earliest reference we actually have to the word Easter. And again, it probably derives from the Proto-Germanic word astron, which just means to rise or to shine.
Yes. Yeah, and that's what I've found in my research on this topic. I remember reading Hislop and the two Babylons, and I wasn't convinced. I didn't immediately become a Christmas and Easter are pagan. I can't have anything to do with them. It was like, well, that's interesting information. I'm not sure what to do with that. And I'm not like I don't remember clearly what I was thinking about it when I read it and after I read it. Um, I don't know how much my mind went through. Can pagan stuff be redeemed and used for Christ? Um, I think I would be in the position today where I would say no. But finding this information that they never were pagan, it's very disappointing that those claims had been made, that mistake was made by carelessness. It seems at best it would have to be carelessness. I don't think it was malicious. Um, but I think it's also um, it's sort of easy to do because if you look from 2,000 years away, there has been paganism that has crept in. There are lots of people that like to claim that it's pagan on both sides of the fence. There are Christians that like to claim that it's pagan, and there are non Christians who like to claim that it's pagan. Pagans love to claim that it's pagan because, Christianity has come from pagan roots, which is another issue I want to deal with. And there are two excellent. I know we're straying around a bit, but this is a bit more of a fundamental issue to this whole topic. Is that there's a lot of claims that Christianity comes from pagan roots, just the whole idea of Christianity, the idea of gods that have come down from heaven and had a virgin birth and had 12 followers, and this whole, I think it's called the Zeitgeist. There was a movie called Zeitgeist that claimed that a whole idea that is in Christianity had been in pagan myths before Christianity came on the scene, and Christianity is just a reworking of that, and it's become successful. But paganism is the platform for Christianity. This is a whole load of garbage, and there was lie after lie after lie in the Zeitgeist movie, and there are people, non-Christians today, who still repeat it. And it's very disappointing when Christians repeat these lies. We should be above that sort of thing. Christianity is not founded on paganism, never has been, in no way. There's no evidence for it. There's lots of claims about it. There's lots of deception and lies out there. What I'm doing is updating the description for this video to add sources about that. There's two web pages on creation.com. One of them entitled "Was Christianity Plagiarized from Pagan Myths?" and the other one, "Pagan Copycat Thesis Refuted." So if you want to look up those sources and the other sources that I've found on these issue of whether Christmas and Easter are pagan, those will be available in the description very shortly. I'm updating them as we speak.
And by the way, while we're on that topic, because I'm glad you brought up the zeitgeist and stuff like that, because it really is all the same flavor of pop history, right?
Yep.
The Osiris Jesus quote is just as ridiculous, or link, excuse me, is just as ridiculous as the Christmas and Sol Invicti link, which is just as ridiculous as the Easter and Ishtar link, which is just as ridiculous as the claim that there are aliens cutting holes and fancy patterns into cornfields, right? These all kind of come from the same general vein of history, which is popular history, which seeks to discredit the idea not only of Christianity but of the supernatural in general, which is why I brought up the aliens one, right? Because that's another one they like to say, well, X thing is miraculous, therefore it must have happened by aliens, right? That's like the History Channel's famous thing. We're not going to get into that, but obviously just to say this is all the same vein of argumentation, and I like to refer to it as pop history. But it is all equally based in absolutely nothing. And I think it's important for us to note that. I think it's also important for us to note, too, that a big part of the reason why Protestants get so testy with this kind of stuff is because we tend to see these things as Catholic, right? Easter is Catholic, Christmas is Catholic, all this other kind of stuff. It must be Catholic, right? And of course, the Romans do have very strong tradition surrounding these holidays. They consider them feasts of obligation. It makes sense why a lay person who was not informed could mix this up as being a Catholic day. The thing is, the meanings behind the days are not Catholic, and the origins of the days predate any established Catholic church. In fact, they predate the establishment of a Bishop of Rome, even in the case of Easter. In the case of Christmas, we don't have it going back quite that far yet. But if I can get this translation of Theophilus of Antioch into English, we might. It really depends on what that actually says, right? But it's note that these holidays are of great antiquity, well before there was even a Bishop of Rome, let alone a Pope of Rome, let alone a Church of Rome, right? So that's always something we need to remember as well. These are not, the Catholic Church does not have ownership over the days. And by the way, they don't have ownership over the people either. St. Patrick was not Catholic. St. Valentine was not Catholic. The Virgin Mary was not Catholic, etc. Right?
Can I just comment on this term Catholic? Because we use Catholic today to mean Roman Catholicism, but I want to go back to what the roots of the word Catholic even mean. So the further back you go in Christian history, the less that the word Catholic refers to Rome. Rome took over the Catholic Church, which is the true church. Now, I'm not talking about what we call Catholic today. I'm talking about what Catholic originally meant. So originally, Catholic meant the universal Christian church, the consensus of those people who were born again and in whom the Holy Spirit was working and through whom he was speaking. So there was a universal agreement across the area where the gospel had spread to and people had been born again. And that's what Catholic originally meant. We don't use the word Catholic outside of there's the Roman Catholic Church that gets called Catholic. So we don't know that that's what the word means or what it used to mean. But it's important for us to understand this because of the history of how this happened. And also because it's contained in our Christian creeds. The Holy Catholic Church does not refer to the Church of Rome in our creeds. They've stolen that, much like CJ has been saying. They've stolen the Virgin Mary, although I agree with Nicholas, it's not actually the Virgin Mary, but, they think that they've got this, it's Mary. But they've created another Mary, just like they've got another Jesus, they've got another God, they've got another gospel, they've got another, and the list goes on and on. Mm-hmm. So I want people to understand that truth as well.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, I'll just quickly note, if you ever get in conversations with Catholics, they'll often go back to, see, Irenaeus says the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. But the funny thing about that is what they're actually doing is they're translating everything into English except for the word Catholic, which is meant to refer to universal there. And it should read the Universal and Apostolic Church. And it's the same thing you're talking about, right? Where they create this, and really it is similar to what Nick says, right? Because in the end, their quote Virgin Mary is not the real Mary. Their Saint Peter is not the real Peter. And of course their Jesus is not the real Jesus. So it is indeed a figment of the collective Catholic imagination.
Yeah. One more thing, if I may, on this, that I was going to say, I've forgotten what it is. Let me talk about St. Peter for a second. I don't even like calling him St. Peter. Peter the Apostle. When Jesus said to him, "On this rock I will build my church," he wasn't talking about Peter. We have that recorded for us in Greek. The word for Peter in Greek is Petros, which does not mean a rock that you can build a church on. It means a pebble or a stone that is too small to be a foundation. And when Jesus says the word rock, he's using the word Petra, which means a foundational rock. It literally means a cliff face, but it was also used to mean a foundation that you could build a building on. So when he said to Peter, "Thou art Petros, and upon this rock I will build my church," Jesus was actually talking about himself. Check 1 Corinthians 3:11. There is no other foundation laid than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the only rock. You can also confirm it from Matthew 7, that Jesus says, "He who hears my words and does them is building on a rock." That's the same as building on Jesus. The other understanding you could have of that passage is that Jesus has proclaimed that Jesus is the Christ, because Jesus says to him, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter responds, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Flesh and blood has not revealed this unto you, but my Father which is in heaven." And it could be that it's Jesus' words that Jesus is referring to. So upon this rock, the confirmation of your mouth. But once again, that's still Jesus. Because what's the words coming out of Peter's mouth is that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So Peter is not the rock. Jesus Christ is the rock. There is one other verse in Ephesians that talks about the foundation of the apostles and prophets, but it would be better to understand that as the foundation that the apostles and prophets have, that they are proclaiming to us, which is Jesus Christ.
And by the way, real quickly, I'll just note on that, it's important to note there's actually a polemic in what Jesus said there that specifically precludes Peter, right? Because he says, "Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you," emphasis on Peter, right? "But my Father." So now you can get confused. Is the emphasis on Peter? And Jesus precludes that. He says, "No, no, 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 because you got this revelation, but you are pebble, and on this rock will I build my church," right? So he actually specifically precludes the Catholic notion, almost as if he's God and he can see the future, right? But nonetheless, he literally precludes this Catholic notion by saying, "You may have gotten this revelation, but you are in fact pebble, and on this rock will I build my church."
Yeah. So Paul asks, why does the date of Easter change each year to follow the first full moon after the spring equinox? I'm sure do you have an answer ready for that one, or do you want me to take
Absolutely.
a stab at it?
It's a great question, and it is one of these questions that is, unfortunately, it is based in a less than savory history, I will say. But nonetheless, we can give you the full breakdown. So it's done by a process that is today called computus, which is basically the Latin word for computation. And the idea is that you take the first Sunday after the first Sunday after the first new moon of the spring season. So get your spring equinox, then the first new moon from that spring equinox, you count to the first Sunday, and then from there you have your Easter date. Kind of complicated and needlessly so, right? So why? It actually goes back to a very, very long time ago, namely the early 200s, believe it or not, when there started to be a controversy that was known as the Quartodeciman controversy. So to go way back into history, Easter was being celebrated really, really early on, probably even by the apostles themselves. But there quickly developed two separate traditions, right, in celebrating Easter. In the East, they tended to celebrate Easter on the high Shabbat of Passover, which is the high Sabbath, the Passover's feast day, right? In the West, they tended to celebrate it on the first Sunday of the Passover week, which is not quite the same as what we have today, but obviously very similar, especially when one considers how exactly the Jewish calendar is established, right? It's a lunar calendar very much based off of the lunar cycles. And so things like equinoxes and solstices and things of that nature are very important. For a while, there was just simply a live and let live mentality. There is an apostle of John whose name is Polycarp, who actually went to meet with one of the church leaders from the West. I can't remember his name at the moment, but it'll come to me at some point here. The church leader from the West said, "Hey, we celebrate the resurrection on the first Sunday of that week," and Polycarp says, "Well, we actually celebrated on the Passover feast day because that's technically the day Jesus was crucified," and they shake hands and move on. Not a big deal, right? Both continue on their tradition. Both claim their tradition goes back to the apostles. And to be honest with you, both are probably right. We're talking the early 100s AD. So these men knew apostles, right? Polycarp was actually tutored by John himself. So it's likely that they're both actually telling the truth. The apostles just didn't have the exact same tradition as each other, which is perfectly fine, of course. They went to different areas of the world, stayed there for decades upon end. I mean, Thomas died in India, is what, at least that's what we have down through the histories, right? So Thomas likely never even saw the rest of the apostles after the Pentecost event, right? When he actually left and went to go do this. It's probably the last time he ever saw them. The point being, if they develop their own different traditions, perfectly fine. What ends up happening is around the time of a bishop named Victor in Rome, which is from 189 to 199, he starts to, because he's incredibly anti-Semitic, say, no, you can't worship the Quartodeciman way, which is worshiping on the or celebrating, excuse me, on the Passover feast day. You have to worship the way the Western Rite does it, which is on this first Sunday. Now, he is very quickly rebuked by all around him. Irenaeus of Lyons writes a rebuke to him, even reminding him, hey, Polycarp and those who came before us agreed to live and let live on this issue. What makes you think you're so great? And Victor does eventually decide to recant, but he's already kind of put the seed there. And unfortunately, Western anti-Semitism only grows more and more and more strong until eventually, by the time we get to the Council of Nicaea, it's canon 20 of the Council of Nicaea, they just outright declare throughout the entire Roman Empire, you have to celebrate Easter this way. Now, I do want to note that does not mean it's wrong to celebrate Easter the way that we do today. Again, the original church was willing to just live and let live on the issue, and both traditions are very likely apostolic. But some anti-Semitic people did end up getting into power in the Roman Church, before it's the Roman Catholic Church, but still the church that is in Rome, right? And they ended up using that power to not only make it to where this is the way we celebrate Easter, but that's also why we have a Sabbath controversy. You know, there was also another thing that the early disciples said, hey, if you worship on Sunday, cool. And if you do it on Saturday, cool. Doesn't matter. The point is worship on a day and go to church, right? But after this controversy started, that started to become an issue, right? And you see this actually continue on in a whole bunch of other issues that we won't get onto today because it would just derail the conversation. The point is, though, that is why we started having a different way of celebrating Easter that is actually variable, right? Excuse me, and not on a set specific date as one might expect, which to this day the Eastern churches still do. The Eastern churches to this day, with the exception of the Constantinople church, a lot of the Eastern churches still celebrate Easter on the Passover high feast day, and they call it Pascha to this day as well.
So one of the things that we need to understand is that because this is not paganism, and there's things that we can't be 100% sure of, there is freedom in this. If you don't agree, that's fine. This is not a vital issue. There are issues that are vital that we cannot have variation on. Whether Jesus is God, for example. No, Jesus has to be God. Whether he bodily resurrected from the dead, no, he has to be bodily resurrected from the dead, 1 Corinthians 15. This is not one of those issues. So let each man be convinced in his own mind, I think, applies here. I was trying to find what guy it might be that Polycarp talked to, but I can't find it.
Actually, I think I might be able to, if I look up Quartodeciman, because I have a bunch of notes. I'm studying this. So if I just look up Quartodeciman in my notes, it should pop up actually. So let's see here. His name is Anicetus.
Oh, Anicetus, okay.
Anicetus, yes. And he was a, well, modern history calls him a bishop. There was no bishops in Rome at the time that Anicetus lived. So that's definitely not true. But the modern history will call him Pope Anicetus, which is even more anachronistic because there wasn't a pope until 150 years after Anicetus died. But nonetheless, if you look him up, he will be called Pope Anicetus, and he spoke with Polycarp on this issue.
But they have to imagine an unbroken chain all the way from Peter, who they imagine died in Rome, with no evidence that I'm aware of, unless you've got evidence that Peter went to Rome. But I have no evidence that he even went to Rome, let alone died there. And yes, then they have to declare these people were the popes of Rome all the way down to today, so that they have an unbroken apostolic chain, unbroken apostolic succession, and a claim to, yes, we are the real church.
Yeah, and it's funny because a lot of these guys, because the earliest ones, there's literally not even a bishop. I won't get too deep into it, but like when you see like Pope Linus and Pope Clement, not only is there not a pope in Rome at this time, there is not even a bishop of Rome at this time. So these guys, you know what I mean? Like they might have been elders in the church. They probably were. In fact, Clement even has an existing epistle. But if you have gone to the same church for a long period of time and are a member in good standing, you're an elder. So that's what Clement was, right? It's really not that huge of a thing. But yeah, they retroactively call these people. Now, Victor was a bishop. By the time Victor comes around, there has been an episcopate established in Rome, but he wasn't a pope. That's important to note. The episcopate was established in Rome about 150 years before they started calling themselves popes. And the first people who called themselves popes actually weren't even Romans. They were in Alexandria. Look up Pope Hercules of Alexandria if you want an example of that. I'm not even kidding. That was his name.
Pope Hercules. So Paul says, let CJ know it's after the first full moon. A new moon is when there is no moon. It's not visible during a new moon.
Right. Sorry about that. So yeah, that's what, when I was discussing Computus, I did say new moon. He is correct. It is full moon.
Good. I didn't know what he was talking about, so I'm glad you remember. So I have put my sources in the description for this. CJ, are you able to email me your sources, or at least some of them? You probably got numerous sources.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some sources in the description that you've used, some major ones, and of course you've got a video that's more comprehensive, at least on the topic of Christmas, and then when we come to Easter, you're going to do a comprehensive video on Easter as well. Whereas I'm not planning to go in as much depth as you do. Essentially, the thumbnail that I've presented is sufficient for me. I'd go a little bit further than that, but
yeah. And so I'm going to send you two sources right now in the live chat.
Good.
Or in the private chat, excuse me. But I'll put them in the live chat too. So the first one we haven't referenced yet, but it's the earliest known reference to Easter as a celebration. And it is a sermon, actually, from a gentleman by the name of Melito of Sardis. Very, very early. It may have been written as early as 120 AD. and it's an entire sermon on the feast, and he speaks of it as if it were a very well established holiday, and that source actually is the source translated into English in case anyone wants to read it. The other thing I'm sending you here is also translated into English, but people do need to take it with a slight grain of salt. Newadvent.org is a Catholic website, and so they will do that thing we were previously talking about where they just like spontaneously decided not to translate a certain word because it fits their agenda. So you'll find the word Catholic in these documents, even though that's meant to mean universal because these were Greek speakers using the Greek word. But New Advent provides a translation of a lot of different works, being that they have a lot of scholars who speak Greek and Latin. And this one in particular is Eusebius's Church History Book 5. And that's where you will find the reference to Anicetus and Polycarp and their discussion with each other. That is also where you find reference to Irenaeus's rebuke of Bishop Victor, as well as Bishop Victor's attempt to stamp out the Quartodecimans. So it's a very useful source for the study of Easter, and especially for what we've discussed so far. And then I'm going to send another source here. This is a little bit of a less official source, but just so people can follow what we were talking about earlier about the name Easter, I'm going to send an etymological dictionary source as well. So just so that people can trace that word for themselves, don't have to take our word for it.
So Keith asks, did he call it Easter or Pesach? Keith, it would have been Pesach or Pascha or whatever, because Easter is a German word, and that would have been hundreds of years later.
Yeah, 100% right. Hundreds of years later. Not that that's a problem, but yeah, it's just not a language that any of them would have understood.
Yeah. Or would have spoken, it just wouldn't have appeared at that time.
Yeah, exactly.
In that way.
And so I got those all in the private chat for you. If you, I guess I should probably drop them in the live chat too. So that
I'm slowly doing that as well.
For sure.
Yep. So there's the new Advent one. I thought I'd done one. So I've added them to the description for people's benefit. Have I saved that yet? No, I haven't saved that. I'll save that now. And then, so I did the new Advent. Let's do the Etym Online.
Yeah, it's a etymological dictionary. I believe they are powered by Cambridge University, if I understand correctly.
Righto. One of the fascinating things to me, and I don't know if you want to comment on this, I'm sure you've encountered it in your study and you may know more about it than I do because I only know bits, but I know more than most people because most people know nothing about it, that a lot of secular scholars are now admitting the truth. They're not trying to pervert the truth. And it's fascinating. I can't think of the name. There's two that are pretty prominent at the moment, saying that Christianity has been the basis for Western civilization and the freedoms that we have, not the evil things, the good things that have happened in Western civilization are because of Christianity. Christianity freed slavery. Christianity provided what is generally called democracy, or the freedoms that we would understand that undergird the freedom of Western civilization and human rights and right to trial. All of these things that have occurred came from Christianity.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting? This is actually something we've seen before. So, for example, it used to be well-established history that King David did not exist and that this was a myth. And if you fast forward, it is now well-established and, in fact, undeniable history that that's just hogwash. We know for a fact David existed. And they used to say this about the Hittites. They'd say the Hittites didn't exist. Then we found that, of course, this is a massive empire, right? So like nowadays, anybody who says the Hittites didn't exist would be like laughed out of even a high school, right? But back in 100 years ago, in 1907, when they first discovered it, that was just like Oh yeah, no, of course the Hittites didn't exist. These are just old myths, just like the Iliad, just like all this other kind of stuff. And lo and behold, slowly but surely, scholarship has had to come our way, and it is happening here with holidays too. One of my favorite videos online, and I still disagree with some in it for certain, but there's a YouTuber called Religion for Breakfast who did a video just this last December on why Dies Natalis Sol Invicti is actually not in any way, shape, or form related to Christmas unless one assumes that they copied Christians, which I, by the way, think that that is the case.
Yeah.
But it's
That's
so
the only possible connection, and like you're saying, that might not even be a connection. But the pagans were upset about this rise of Christianity, and so they started trying to connect in with it. The Christians never borrowed from paganism, not biblical Christians. Only false Christians do that, and there's no evidence that that ever occurred. Yeah,
100%, and yeah, and it's funny too when we start seeing, because he did mention the you just mentioned that there was these false Christians who would do that, and it's totally true, right? We by the time we finally see people converting stuff, like there's a very famous pagan temple that was converted into a church, right? We're talking like the 500s with a well-established pope, with a well-established Romanism. Mariology has been accepted, purgatory has been accepted. You know what I mean? Like, this is clearly not the original Christian church, right? We're talking 500 years removed. In fact, we're even 200 years removed from the Council of Nicaea at that point. We're really far into history. And even then, we're not talking about holidays. We're talking about people converting a temple, a place of worship, right? We don't see anything with holidays at all. And to the best of my knowledge, there is not a single example. Even things like the Annunciation of Mary, which is a completely unscriptural holiday because it celebrates her bodily assumption, which we, of course, do not believe. But even that holiday does not actually have basis in paganism, unless you want to count Catholicism as pagan, which I guess you could. But
But it's not borrowing from paganism outside of Christianity. It's paganism that is now calling itself Christian.
Yeah, exactly. And when we get to some of the stuff about Christmas, you guys will see specifically some of the firsthand sources of pagans directly copying Christianity in an undeniable fashion, which proves that exactly the opposite of what is being accused, what people are accusing Christianity of, is in fact what happened.
Yeah, and that's definitely what my research has found as well, is that neither Easter nor Christmas were borrowing from paganism that existed at all. They were begun from my research. Your research seems to connect them even more clearly to that it was that they're the real events that they claim to be. But my research, they're slightly disconnected from the real events, and so it's people looking back and Christians trying to access those real events. So either way, it's got no connection whatsoever to pagan holidays or to paganism or anything like that, except as that has occurred over time since. But the creation of these holidays or the origin of these holidays has no connection to paganism whatsoever. So we're confirming that with our research that we have, even though we've come to slightly different conclusions, and I need to do more research, it sounds like.
Well, and one thing I do want to point out too, real briefly, is because this is a general rule. If you notice, these guys, they always have a huge dartboard of potential pagan possibilities, right? So it's like, okay, Easter was based off of Lupercalia. Never mind, that didn't work. So it was based off of Ishtar. That didn't work. So it was based off Historia. Okay, that didn't work. You know what I mean? And that should immediately clue you in that these guys don't actually have the evidence on their side, right? When you watch, just think of like your favorite murder show, right? Criminal Minds or whatever. You probably shouldn't watch stuff like Criminal Minds, to be honest with you, but some of the shows aren't that bad. Some of the more cop-related shows aren't as like, let's torture people and show it on the television kind of thing. But you just take your favorite show like that, right? Does the detective ever sit there and say, all right, it's all of these potential possibilities, and we're going to just, leave it there? No, of course not, right? He actually sits there and he follows the evidence and he narrows it down to a single person, and then, eventually you discover. the fact that they can't do that demonstrates very clearly that these holidays are not actually pagan.
Yep, exactly. There was one other point that I was about to make. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the early evidence for Christianity, that Christianity is not invented later. It's not Constantine decided what the books of the Bible will be, as we constantly keep hearing. And I know this is slightly off topic, but this undergirds this whole thing, because people are concerned that Christmas and Easter are Catholic. Yeah, well, by our modern definition of Catholic, that's what the church evolved into, is pagan, and it stopped being the church, and the real church either hid within Catholicism and they didn't actually separate, maybe because they didn't realize they should separate, or because they should have, but they just chose not to. There was persecution on those, and so Christians aren't perfect, but there was a lot of Christians who did separate from Rome, and they got killed for it. They got persecuted for separating from pagan. Right. One more comment I want to make on this whole issue. So notice that it's Rome that is what's called the Catholic. So it's Roman Catholic Church. That's very important. Rome was the empire at the time. Remember the prophecies in the Old Testament that there was Babylonian Empire, and then the Persian, Medo-Persian, but Persian Empire, Greece, and then Rome. And then after Rome, which was iron, remember in Daniel, after Rome, iron would be iron mixed with clay, which is what we have today. And a major power in our world is the Roman iron, so-called Catholic. I hate calling it the Catholic Church, but that's what it's called. Church. And I hate calling it church as well, because it's not a church. The Roman syncretistic paganism is what I prefer to call it, but nobody knows what I'm talking about when I say that, so I have to say Roman Catholic Church. But no, the Bible was decided within 100 years. It was universally accepted by born-again Christians what books were and weren't in the Bible. Not 100%. There was some question on some of the books. Some of the books weren't mentioned. Oh, by the way, I better deal with Paul Camish before I forget. Does the word holiday come from holy day? Short answer, yes. Everything that I've ever heard confirms that that's definitely the etymology of holiday, is holy day.
Yeah, 100%. It's originally the Old English words Haligdag, but Halig translates to holy and Dag translates to day. So it is it's originally from, and actually, interestingly enough, a lot of the old words, like for example the Hebrew Chag, which is what they call their festivals, that also actually refers to a holy day. Or in Latin, I can't drawing a blank on what they call it, but the Latin word for holidays is also derived ultimately from holy days. So yeah, it's actually quite cross-cultural for us to refer to holy days as the same as holidays. Ferialis, that's what they're called. Sorry, Ferialis.
Feliz Navidad. So back to this issue, and I don't know if you want to comment on this as well, CJ. Back to this issue of Christianity was established very early. What the Bible was, what the Christian doctrines were, Jesus is God, is a very, 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 very early. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that the verses stating what the gospel is in 1 Corinthians 15 were actually within months of Jesus' death. And Paul is just confirming that by including it in the book of Corinthians, which was also a very early book, within decades, or maybe even less, I'm not sure, of Jesus' death. So these truths that we hold as central orthodox truths in the lowercase o, the things that are orthodox to biblical Christianity, were there in the early church. They're not late inventions. There's no gap that causes error and confusion and misunderstanding to creep in.
And to give kind of an overview of that, because that is 100% true. We have very clear and demonstrable evidence of the every work of the Bible together with each other as a set canon, at least as early as Oregon. Oregon is in the 200s, but you do have to understand we're going back and looking at this stuff through history. So that doesn't mean that's the earliest that exists, right? That's just the earliest we've been able to find. And he's about 235. He has all our Old Testament books and all our New Testament books in a single list together. So that, I mean, that's a pretty early find there, right? We have evidence outside of that, though, that does suggest it definitely can go a lot farther back. For example, Irenaeus, when he speaks of the Gospels, speaks very clearly of four, and they're the four that we know of today. That pushes us back to the 180s. Justin Martyr, who is in the 140s, talks about having the epistles of the apostles, which that's obviously incredibly early on there as well. It appears that Peter and Paul, Peter quotes Paul and Paul quotes Luke, so they even self-reference each other, right? Yeah. And if you look at the historians, the early historians like Eusebius, for example, and of the aforementioned Irenaeus and some others, they were under the impression, as the people closest to this situation, and so therefore I think very good witnesses, that the books of the Bible, with the exception of Revelation, were all done by 65. The first one being Matthew, which I think they have being published at around 41. It's about 8 years after the crucifixion. Followed very quickly by Mark, which is followed very quickly by some of Paul's letters, and Luke, Acts, and a whole bunch of the others coming in the 60s. And then the last book we actually have written is like 3 decades removed from everything else, and that would be Revelation. So basically the idea just kind of being here that, we have from these guys the impression of these books being very, very, very early on. And they are unanimous in this issue, in these issues, I should say. And obviously there are small little things in there where they're not necessarily unanimous, and so I shouldn't speak that boldly, but in most of these issues, right? So for example, with Matthew, every church father who references Matthew talks about Matthew as having written it, talks about Matthew as having written it in whatever language the Hebrews spoke, which was likely Aramaic, and talks about Matthew having written it as the first book of the New Testament within a decade of Jesus's crucifixion. They're unanimous on that. Now, these guys are not unanimous on practically anything, right? So we need to understand it's a big deal when they're unanimous on these historical facts, because they're not unanimous on anything, right? They fight each other all the time. But when it comes to these facts of history, like who wrote Matthew and when and why and how early was it, and when was Jesus crucified, and Book of Revelation and all these other kinds of stuff, as far as these historical facts are concerned, unanimity all across the board. I think that's because they had access to information that demonstrated these things were true.
So I just want to welcome Jamie. There's many comments I still want to make, but I assume Jamie wanted to comment on something.
Oh, I was thinking about the thing with the holidays. I think I don't have any disagreements per se. I just was going to say, and hopefully I can articulate this. There's the question of when, when certain changes might have had, became regular in the overall church or whatever, right? So there's the question. You can kind of make it in two questions, like. And this could relate to the Sabbath. It could relate to the holidays, which I think are slightly different categories. But I think you can ask the question: how did it become what it is, and then what the actual day is, and does the differentiation really matter that much? I'm not sure it does, but.
So were you listening earlier when we discussed that, Jamie? Because we have
been
through that, I think.
Oh, okay.
So did you have
I didn't see it right away. Sorry. Yeah, I may
right. So we did discuss why there's a difference between the East and the West Christian church, so the Eastern Orthodox and the Western tradition. Um,
Why
that's
do you guys? Can I ask? Here, I'll ask a more pointed question about that. And I'm so I tend to think that that's probably likely what you're saying about the. I did catch part of that where you said they it was just a tradition, right? Like the East tended to be celebrated on the Jewish date, right, off of their calendar, and then the West didn't. I wonder why the West even started the tradition of it being different. Do you have any idea?
I suspect that both traditions are apostolic in nature. I suspect that whichever apostles went into the West, for whatever reason, they wanted to celebrate the actual day of the week. And the apostles that stayed in the East, for whatever reason, wanted to celebrate the actual Passover, likely because the ones in the East were closer to their Jewish roots. Honestly, I mean, it's probably that simple.
Right. So
But
you think when they left the area, it, I have a little trouble wondering. I mean, like, it really doesn't actually matter. I don't think to me on that one. It's just like, but I wonder like if they all come from out of the same spot. You'd think that they would tend to do the same unless there was some like particular reason not to. I guess if you were just right, because I guess the other view that doesn't do it on the Passover would be like they. But you'd think he'd have the tradition of it, or coming from the having come out of the East, or you'd think he'd have maybe they're just using a different calendar and so it makes sense somehow. I don't know. You just think that he lost that idea. I mean, I'm trying to think how that would work. You know what I mean?
well, if you consider the apostles who went to the West, for example, Paul, Paul's he's not a holiday stickler, is he? Right? Paul's the guy who wrote, "Let each man be convinced in his own mind." So it makes perfect sense that he would be the one who carries forward a different tradition, right? Whereas John, and one of the apostles who stays in the East, we see from Acts 15 that he was a little bit of a stickler for tradition, right? And it could honestly be something that's actually that simple. I mean, the way I see it is Polycarp got his tradition of how to celebrate the Passover / Easter, because he was actually celebrating the resurrection, not the Passover itself, right? From John the Apostle himself, right? And the way he did it is by celebrating the Passover feast. And Anicetus, while I don't know that he actually got it from a apostle directly, is one who was pupiled by pupils of Paul, specifically Clement of Rome, right? So it seemed like these guys are early enough that they should have traditions that are coming from, whatever the original church here was. They're both clearly Christians. They both agree with each other that the other is Christian. They agree to live and let live on the issue. Neither challenges the other when he says, "Hey, I got this from an apostle," right? And I think, honestly, I think it really is as simple as one guy went one way and he celebrated one way, and one guy went another and he celebrated the other. You know what I mean? And then we carried forward both traditions. And the thing is, we carried forward both traditions for almost 300 years before it actually became a issue that was dogmatic, right? It was the Council of Nicaea that made this issue dogmatic. The first time somebody tried to make this issue dogmatic, Bishop Victor, in the very late 100s, second century, he was rebuked by everybody, Western or Eastern. They were saying, "No, you don't have a right to make this a doctrinal issue. It's not," right? We're talking the 190s. This is a really short period of time after the crucifixion.
Regarding what now? What is the issue regarding on this matter? With this?
He said that he would try to enforce the Western way of celebrating Easter.
I see. So I would think that, I think that would be wrong to do. So, like, because I would argue, there's no doubt you can argue that Paul said regarding the festivals that they were shadows, and so that's obviously something that you shouldn't be enforcing on people. The question of those being the celebrations being fulfilled in Christ, right? And so that should be the case. I think what was I going to say? I'll have to think a little bit before I say any more. I'm in agreement with you there. I'm totally in agreement with that.
Well, the point though, to just reiterate, right, is just to say, Anicetus and Polycarp, when they spoke about this, they are both very, very near to the apostles and in direct apostolic line. And I personally don't see any way to explain that other than to say there are apostles who wanted to continue in their Jewish traditions, and that is their right, of course, because the Bible never says you can't keep the feasts. It just says that you can't force others, right? And there were others who wanted to celebrate specifically the resurrection of Christ. And to be honest with you, I think that the fact that they were willing to leave it at that is probably a sign that not only were they both apostolic, like I just said, but also that we should just leave it at that, right? It is kind of, I even celebrate both.
Do you? Oh, that's what I was gonna say. Like, the only thing I think I might disagree with you on is, but it really is kind of doesn't matter. But I would suspect that probably everybody coming from out of, I mean, the apostles. I would suspect all the apostles were probably celebrating the feast day, or I mean, Easter on Passover, and then because it didn't matter, like as early on when they were out of the area for whatever reason, it could change because it just didn't matter. But I mean, that's just like a gut feeling, I guess. But I don't know. I mean, it doesn't really matter. But yeah, I think you're saying it right.
Can I just point out that in a very real sense, we are not celebrating Passover the way that the Jews do, because they have to sacrifice a lamb for Passover, and we have a lamb that has been sacrificed. We are not sacrificing a lamb again. We are celebrating something different than the Jewish Passover.
And they're even celebrating something different than the original Passover, right? Because they can't even do it as it would be, or is that
true?
Wrong?
But even if they could celebrate the original, that is not what we are celebrating.
And that is true, right? Each of these, and this is something, by the way, for those who do like to celebrate the Jewish holidays, I do think it's always important for us to point out that these holidays are much greater in value to us as Christians in a certain way, right? And what I mean by that is, like, so when it's one thing to, and I don't, I'm not opposed to anybody teaching their kids or saying, hey, this time when Moses did this thing and God did this thing through Moses, all that kind of stuff. Absolutely. But you have to always add on top of that, though. But guess what? We actually have the fulfillment of this holiday, the Passover lamb, and the blood has been put over our doorposts so that the death angel flies over us, right? Passes over us, I should say. Flies over us. Makes it sound a little bit too magical, but you know what I mean? And so, so I totally am 100% with you there, Graham.
That was the whole point of it originally, to be fulfilled, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I better put Kevin's question up. I wanted to make a comment about Passover. It seems to me that, so that I don't forget, when it says Passover and it talks about the angel of the Lord passing over, it's more the idea that the angel of the Lord was over and the angel of the death passed. And I'd love to look at that passage and investigate that a little bit more with people. But when I looked at the passage and did a bit of study on it, that was what I was seeing in the passage, is that God was over the people and the angel of death passed. I don't know whether he passed over or passed by, but that's the idea of Passover. The angel of the death is the passing bit, and it's the angel of the Lord protecting the people who is over.
I've been wondering about this. This is a great question, because I've kind of had the hunch that the angel of death could be understood to be like God's judgment kind of thing, and like it could be that like Christ or whatever is the angel of death in that sense, but in a very understood.
So I don't disagree that it could be one angel, but the death aspect passes and the protective aspect is over the people that had the blood on the door.
Yeah, that's the two ways I think I've wondered about. Like, it could be either. I've kind of leaned that it was one, and it just depends. You could kind of take it less literal, I guess you could say, and like in some sense, I guess, and then just like understand it to be an idea or whatever, less than an actual angel, like flying over everybody's
And
house or something.
I'll have to do a show on the passage. I have preached on the passage previously, but I'll have to do a show on the passage and show people from Scripture where I'm getting that.
Which angel killed all those Assyrians or whatever it was? You know, the 180.
An angel of the Lord. I don't know if it was the angel.
It was
of the
an
Lord.
angel or the angel.
I think so. I'd have to check that out. CJ, did you have any comment on that aspect of Passover before we get to Kevin's question, or do you want to jump to Kevin's question? Why are Easter?
I think I'm okay to just jump to Kevin's question.
So he asks,
I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna leave and let you guys do your thing. And good to see you guys both.
thanks, Jamie. Why are Easter and Passover separate in Scripture? Acts 12:4 implies that Easter was something already in practice. Now, I have an answer to this, but if you've got one, I'll let you answer it.
Absolutely. So, so I think the question will have kind of a dual pronged answer. The first prong of the answer is very rarely our beloved King James does make an error, and I think it did here. The original word is Pascha, and it does actually properly translate as the Passover. And if you, for example, in New King James, or even if you don't want to trust the New King James, you can also go before the King James, like a Geneva Bible or a Wycliffe. They actually will translate it typically as Passover.
Or just go back to the Greek. It's the same word as Passover.
Yeah, exactly. So it's obviously not a big deal because to an extent it's sort of the same thing for the particular apostles in question, you would think. They obviously, knowing that Jesus was crucified on the Passover feast day, would every time that feast day comes around, they've been celebrating it since they were children, right? But now they have a whole new reason to be celebrating. And there's no way that was lost on them, right? But so that's the first part of the question. Now, the second thing is, would Easter and Passover be separate in Scripture? And I think there is a sense in which the answer is yes, and we kind of have already hinted to it a little earlier. Right, the Passover, of course, meets its fulfillment in Jesus. And we should always, if we are celebrating the Passover or noting the Passover, be aware of that. Hang on just a second.
So Brandon says, get that puppy a treat already.
Sorry about that, friends. I just
fine.
had to get the noisiest dog breed in the world, I swear.
So back to Scripture indicating that Easter and Passover were starting to separate already, even in Scripture.
Yeah. So the first thing is we do have to understand the holidays themselves are commemorating different events, right? Passover meets a fulfillment in the resurrection, but it's not commemorating the resurrection. It's commemorating the event that took place 3,400 years ago in Egypt, right? Which is a good thing to celebrate. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that that's bad, but I am just saying that the holiday of Passover is meeting its fulfillment in, not specifically commemorating the resurrection, whereas Easter is specifically commemorating the resurrection. Now, of course, like I said, if you're one who celebrates Passover, you should be aware of that. In fact, you should be hyper aware of that fulfillment. In fact, I would even go as far as to say, if you did not, if you were not hyper aware of that fulfillment, you probably shouldn't be celebrating the Jewish holidays. Honestly, like if it's going to be a stumbling block for you, just don't do it. But with that being said, the specific commemoration is different, right? Now, what about scriptural evidence that they may be separated? Well, believe it or not, I'm actually going to quote Acts 12:4 in this particular regard, because even though I do think this demonstrates a small little bit of an error in the King James, I do also think it does demonstrate that there's starting to be somewhat of a separation here, right? Because we see, and seeing that this pleased the Jews, Herod proceeded to seize Peter during the feast of unleavened bread. He arrested him and put him in prison, and handing him over to the guard to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out to the people after the Passover. Now, the Passover here is obviously used to reference what the King James says as Easter, right? And if we go back to the Greek, like we said, it does say Pascha, right? But notice that it appears that there is a little bit of a, shall we say, discrepancy here, right? It's not really a discrepancy, but if you just kind of look, you notice that he is being apprehended during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a specific portion after the Passover feast, right? In other words, it's all the holiday Passover, but the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a subsect of it after the Passover feast, which is that very first day, right? So he's taken within that period, but then it says he wants to slay him after the Passover. I would argue that the use of the word Pascha here is potentially to indicate there might have been another Paschal celebration to come, and that it potentially was not actually Jewish centric, because at that point the Jewish centric one has already happened, right? In other words, it's not, I don't think it's intending to tell us, hey, this is where Easter comes from, but I think it might be a little bit of a reference to this being where where Easter is, because of the fact that it appears to be 2 separate individual Passover feasts. That I'm reading into that, but I'm not the first person to see that. Kent Hovind has said that before. Numerous other scholars who have studied the King James itself, wanting to know why this says Easter, have said that before. In fact, that might even be the reason for the mistranslation, is that the King James translators might have thought that that's what was being communicated here. So it's possible, not definitive, but it is possible.
Yeah, and I've heard that before as well. So I can't remember where I've heard that from. But yeah, someone was defending that the King James might not be as wrong as it appears on the surface. So in English, this is a bit confusing for us, because we go, well, this is 2 different words in English. But in Greek, it's 1 word. But there is evidence, like CJ is suggesting, that I have seen as well, that maybe this is referring to something slightly different, that things are starting to change, and the Bible is recording that. So the King James translators might not be wrong to have called this one Easter, but it's still uncertain. It's just, yeah, we can't be 100% sure what's going on here. So hopefully that answers that one. There was something else that there's about 3 things that I wanted to say earlier. So, the evidence for Pilate. So until very recently, secular scholarship said that Pilate didn't exist because they had no evidence outside the Bible for him, but they found evidence recently, I've heard. And it's interesting because the evidence suggests that Pilate was scrubbed from history by Rome. There was a problem that happened between Pilate and Caesar later on. I don't know which Caesar. And so he got scrubbed from history by Rome. But they've recently uncovered evidence that he existed outside of the Bible. There's evidence that he existed. So that feeds back into what CJ was saying earlier, like the Hittites, King David, all of these other things that secular history goes, no, those things never existed because we've got no evidence from them outside the Bible. And because we don't believe the Bible, we reject that evidence. In fact, not just because we don't believe the Bible, but we are opposed to the Bible. Obviously, these people are. But yes, evidence is starting to come out, and the evidence is mounting that you can confirm the Bible even from secular sources, and secular historians and archaeologists and so forth are starting to admit this. In fact, this feeds into one of my other favorite topics, and I believe you had David Roll on your show recently, CJ.
Twice now, actually.
Oh, there we go. And I loved his. I was going to say I loved his role in Patterns of Evidence Exodus, um, but yes, I love the information that he provided, and that what secular historians have done with the Exodus. I really, really encourage people to look this up. Patterns of Evidence Exodus, brilliant. Um, there are mountains of evidence that the Jews, the Hebrews, were in Egypt. Secular historians, many secular historians will say there's no evidence, but it's because they're looking in the wrong spot. They make one little mistake based on the Bible and they say, oh, this is what the Bible means. So they look over here, and they assume that they're understanding the Bible correctly here, and then they go, well, there's no evidence, so therefore the Bible must be wrong. But then they don't go back and go, well, why are we trusting the Bible to look there? It's like, what is wrong with you people? But if you look over here and you find these mountains of evidence, and you go, well, actually, that does fit the Bible. You just have to understand it correctly and not misinterpret it. But yeah, it's wonderful. But that's not our topic. Feel free to comment on it if you want, CJ. But what else do we need to talk about?
Well, let's see. We talked about, for Easter specifically, we talked about the name, the computation of it, some of the ancient controversies about it, where the traditions might come from, and also I did drop a link for the earliest homily on it. So I think that is pretty good for Easter as far as general information is concerned. If you want to talk anything about Christmas,
let's go to Christmas. Let's spend at least a little bit of time with Christmas. So once again, lots of claims that it's pagan, that it comes from Saturnalia, that it's connected to the pagan celebration of the winter solstice, and the sun rising again, and this is how Jesus' birth, the light coming into the world, all of this sort of thing. Because what happens at winter solstice, at least in the northern hemisphere, is that on about the 21st of December, depending on the year, 21st, and where you are on the face of the earth, 21st or 22nd of December is the shortest day of the year in the northern hemisphere. And so it's because of this. And then the 23rd, you're celebrating, oh, the sun's coming back, winter is going to be over, and this time of darkness and freezing cold, and we might die, and are we going to be able to plant crops again? That's over. And people love to connect this to paganism. They love to talk about Sol Invictus and Saturnalia as pagan festivals. The problem with all of this is, well, it's not exactly this. I'll talk about the research, and then CJ, if there's anything you want to add or correct. So my research, some of these things are after Christianity. Some of these things, yes, there were pagan festivals around that time, but there's no evidence of any connection to Christmas at all. And they're not even the same day as Christmas. 25th of December is not the 23rd of December. There's no evidence whatsoever. The only thing that I would suggest is a possibility that Christmas might be connected back to, but this is by God, is Hanukkah, the festival of lights. And Christmas, I would say, is the Christian festival of lights, but even that is a tenuous connection, and it's only I think by God's providence that these things could be even connected in the first place. But really, Christmas is a standalone event that Jesus Christ came into the world. Now, in my research, I'm not convinced that it's the 25th of December, but I'd love to be convinced by CJ, and feel free to comment on any of that or anything else.
Absolutely. So a couple things that I want to definitely mention here. So the first thing is just to give you guys a little bit of a look into the debunking of this idea for holidays, that the pagan holidays that they copied, right? We heard two of them that are referenced here in Dies Natalia Sol Invicti and Saturnalia, and there's another one that people very famously like to use, which is Yule. which is a Germanic holiday. I'm going to just give you guys some brief points one by one to show you why that's certainly not true. So the first one is Saturnalia. This one's pretty fun because Saturnalia takes place December 17th to the 23rd, right? So it's a 7-day long holiday at its peak. And December is a 31-day month. Well, if you just do a little bit of math, that means you got a 1 and 4.5 chance, or 22.5% chance of any event at all in December taking place on Saturnalia. And yet, by miracle, December 25th doesn't. I think that's kind of funny personally, but it's one of those kind of like slaps on the head to the pop historian where they're like, oh, well, see, it's near Saturnalia. And it's like, yeah, it had a very large chance of being on Saturnalia just by virtue of taking place in December, and yet doesn't. That's pretty interesting. The second thing that is important to note there is just the vast differences between Saturnalia and Christmas. Saturnalia is not a birth festival. Saturnalia is not a festival that is associated with anything as far as like the what would you say? Excuse me, nativities are concerned, which is I guess is the same way of saying what I just did. But anyways, Saturnalia is not a major feast day. If you mean feast day like Christians mean, if you mean feast day as in people gluttonously ate, well then sure, I guess every single holiday counts. But if you mean feast day as in a day when the different people came together for an act of worship or an act of some sort of family get together, that's not Saturnalia. Saturnalia is much more comparable to like Mardi Gras, where you go out to have a big party in the streets with all your friends and get smash drunk. And I'm not even kidding, actually get smash drunk and dance naked and have orgies and all that other kind of stuff. Because the point of Saturnalia was to overthrow the social order for a week. It's kind of like the Purge, but in real life, minus the murder, of course. But that was the whole idea, is they would overturn social order for a moment. Men and women were equal. Saint and servant were equal. You could do whatever you want. Gambling is legal. The gladiators fighting are dwarves because that's not the way it's supposed to be, and all this other kind of stuff. Completely and totally different from Christmas, which is the celebration of the birth of an individual, right? Had nothing to do with light, had nothing to do with the sun. Some people will say Saturnalia is a festival of the lights. That's not true. Has nothing to do with the sun whatsoever. So not only do they not get the links right, but they don't even get the holiday that they're actually accusing us of celebrating right. So that's a very interesting thing there. And by the way, here's another thing I want to point out really quickly when it comes to this particular point. Every single month on the calendar has plural holidays in it. In fact, every single day on the calendar has plural holidays on it. So the idea that, well, it's close, they're near each other, and so therefore they must be related, that would literally mean you cannot celebrate anything. Obviously, the birthday of George Lucas is related to the birthday of Israel because it happens to be the same day, right? Of course not. Right? Doesn't make any sense. So I just, people do have to note that. The second holiday, Dies Natalia Sol Invicti. We actually have almost undeniable evidence at this point that holiday was copying Christianity and not the other way around. So the earliest potential possible celebration of this holiday would be December 25th, 274. Okay. And this would be the birth of the unconquered sun, right? Which could have potentially been as early as 274. 3 problems with this. Number one, we have the commentary on Daniel from Hippolytus of Rome, translated into English, which comes from 204 and describes Jesus's birth as December 25th. So that's 70 years prior. So very much predating this. Problem number 2, there is no evidence whatsoever that December 25th, 274 was the establishment of a holiday. Rather, it was the establishment of a temple in the name of this god. And the third problem, and this is the biggest problem, is that Aurelian was actively persecuting Christians. Meaning that when he decided he wanted to do something on this date that the Christians had already established as their feast date, what he's trying to do, at least what most historians think today he was trying to do, is actually stamp out Christian influence by replacing Christ with his new, shiny, fancy god. Pun totally intended, by the way. And why do I say new? Well, because Aurelian was introducing a god that the Romans did not have major festivals for. Okay, that's something you guys got to understand. Sol did not have major festivals before Aurelian, and arguably not even during the time of Aurelian. Again, he might have just been establishing a temple for his cultic god and trying to stamp out Christianity that way rather than actually establishing a holiday. So in other words, the idea that Sol Invictus seriously existed at Aurelian's time is even actively in question, right? And even if it did, like I said, it's very firmly established why he would do this and when he did it and all those other sorts of things. By the way, I mentioned that Hippolytus of Rome is in the English language. Well, I am currently, as we speak, speaking to Latin translators and to potentially get Theophilus of Antioch's document on Christmas translated into English. If we do that, we're going to be the first people to do it. So that's going to be a major breakthrough. And that could potentially have evidence. The Roman Church says it does. And I can't speak Latin, so I can't verify it, right? The Roman Church says that that actually includes evidence of Theophilus of Antioch celebrating Christmas on December 25th. If that's true, that puts us 100 years before Aurelian, because he would be writing that in about the year 170. So the sources that I quote as the earliest may not actually be the earliest. It just might be that we haven't translated what is the earliest quite yet, but we're working on it, by the way. The last one, Yule, is actually the one that's most easy to deal with because it's not disputable that Yule was placed on December 25th because people wanted to copy Christianity. Yule comes from the word Yuli. Yuli was a month of time that took place between late December and early January. So it's possible that the original date for Yule was not even in the month of December. It's not possible that it was on December 25th. We know that indisputably because the saga of Hakon the Good tells us that Hakon the Good in the year 950, we are 750 years removed from Hippolytus of Rome's reference to celebrating Christmas on December 25th. In 950, Hakon the Good forcibly changed the holiday of Yule to coincide with the Christmas holiday, not the other way around, which means two things. Number one, Yule was copying Christmas, not the other way around, as we just said. And number two, this is the most important thing, Yule literally cannot be on December 25th because it would make no sense to change it to December 25th if it was already on December 25th. See what I'm saying? So all three of the major holidays people like to use, easily debunked. The other ones people like to use, like it's the birth of Nimrod or the birth of Mithras, are honestly laughable. You can just write those off without even doing serious research because there's just no evidence to support it. And the last one is the solstice. Well, the solstice takes place on the 21st, not the 25th. So not the same.
Yep, very comprehensive. Thank you, CJ. Yes, I'd combined some of those together, so that clears a few things up. Any other comments on Christmas?
I feel like there was some other comments I wanted to make, but to be honest, I can't really remember because.
Well, I think you have some evidence that Jesus might have actually been born on the 25th of December.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who want not a full look into this, because I have enough evidence that I'm actually going to be writing a book about this, but I did do an hour-long episode on this. So if you want a little bit more evidence that I'm about to provide, you can receive that on my channel. It's my most recent episode. To give you guys a little bit of a glimpse into some of the evidence, I'll give you the calendar argument because it's probably one of the more convincing and it's one of the easiest to just break down. So Nisan 1, otherwise known as Aviv 1, is the first day of the biblical calendar, right? You can find this in Exodus 12. The month that includes Passover, which is called variously Nisan or Aviv, is the first month of the Hebrew New Year. And the earliest, sorry, my dog is going crazy. His friends are outside and he can't go see them, so he's very sad about it. So the earliest that Nisan 1, the first day of this year, can take place is March the 7th. And the latest that it can take place is April the 6th, right? Well, if you go to 1 Chronicles 24, it tells you the divisions of the priesthood. And the divisions are set in 24 different groups, the 8th group being Abaya. Abaya is important because that's the division that Zacharias, father of John the Baptist, is a part of. And these cycles would double every year because there's obviously more than 24 weeks in a year, right? So they would double. That would get you to your 48 weeks. And then 4 of the major festivals would actually have all of the Jewish nation there, which would include all of the priests. So there was no need to specify a certain priestly division. So you go to Luke chapter 1, you find the division of Abaya is burning incense, and that it is immediately after this that John the Baptist is conceived. Well, we already previously gave you the earliest possible date for Nisan 1 and the latest, which was March 7th and April 6th. If you count 8 weeks from either of those dates, you will get yourself to, let me go ahead and pull it up here because I just actually had it, May 2nd to June the 1st. And if you go to the 32nd week, which would be his second cycle of the year, you would get to October 17th to November 16th. Now, each of those things is going to be inclusive. So, in other words, if we're going to the week of October 17th is actually going to be the last day that he is doing work, not the first day that he's doing work, right? The difference there is in saying, so I am currently 23, but I'm in my 24th year, right? So depending on how you count time, that number can be different. I'm in my 24th year, meaning I am living the 24th year of my life, but I haven't completed the 24th year of my life, so I only say I'm 23, right? The Jews count this stuff inclusively, so we're going to have to take that into account when we do our calculation here. So if we go from the earliest we can get, that's going to be between May and June, and count 15 months forward. Why 15 months? Well, because John the Baptist is born 6 months before Jesus. We see that also in Luke 1. If we count 15 months forward from that period, we're going to get sometime in May or June, right? So that's 7. Well, hang on. Let me make sure I did my math right. That's not right, actually. We're going to get some time in August or September. There you go. 15 months from May or June puts you at August or September. And if you count 15 months from October to November, then that is actually going to place you in January to February. But recall that the Jews are inclusive, not like we are. So that actually is the latest possible date we go. And we actually see this in Luke chapter 1. It says, in her 6th month, not when she was 6 months pregnant. That means she is somewhere between 5 and 6 months pregnant, right? And so when you factor that into your calculation, it gives you a period between 1217 as the latest possible date Jesus could, or the earliest possible date Jesus could be born if Abaya was on his 32nd week, and January 17 as the latest he could be born if he was on the 32nd week. So obviously that assumes that he was doing his 32nd week and not his 8th week. But if he was doing his 32nd week, the earliest he could have been born is December 17th, and the latest he could have been born is January 17th. And both traditional dates for Jesus's birth fit into that time frame, which are December 25th and January 6th.
Boom. No. Any other comments, CJ?
I'll only say on that one that there is I can explain what I just did in a much more in-depth fashion than I do in my video.
So I've given people that video. It's in the chat. I've also added it to the video description for this video. So if you want to look at that, go over to CJ's channel. CJ is going to continue presenting on holidays throughout the following year, through the rest of this year. So you can go to his channel. You can join the conversation over there. Lots of interesting information.
Yeah, and thank you very much for that.
Oh, well, I really appreciate you being here. I find these sort of things fascinating because there's a lot of dispute about it, and as much as possible, we want to resolve disputes and come to a conclusion about what the truth is. But also, there's a lot of undermining of Christianity that is going on, and this confusion about it, and whether we should be celebrating pagan holidays or not. Well, obviously, we shouldn't. be celebrating pagan holidays. When CJ was talking about Saturnalia and what we don't want to have anything to do with that. As Christians, it annoys me when Christians go, oh, well, it's been Christianized. No. These things don't get Christianized. They're pagan. They belong over there, and we don't want to have anything to do with them. Now, of course, God owns everything, but we don't need to borrow from paganism. And so I can happily celebrate Christmas and Easter because they weren't borrowed from paganism. If they were, I would have a lot more problem with this. And because I was unsure, I was sort of in a middle ground until I went, actually, no, they're not pagan. There's no problem with them. Yeah, but be convinced in your own mind as well. There is freedom in this. So you don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with CJ and I. I'm sure there's numerous things we don't see exactly the same, but it's getting the important things right. Jesus Christ died on the cross. He was God in human flesh. He is still God, of course. That can't stop. But he was God in human flesh that came to earth and died in our place. Now, whether you celebrate his incarnation, his death and resurrection at particular times of the year, even if you do those things, you should be celebrating it every day. Hallelujah. Jesus came to earth to pay for our sins. He died so that our sins could be forgiven. He gave his perfect life. His perfect life was offered up as the perfect sacrifice to pay for sin. That is what we need to remember every single day of the week. So up to you whether you celebrate Christmas and Easter, whatever your view is on these things, that's okay. They're not pagan, don't have anything to do with paganism. But if there's still doubt in your mind or confusion, or you have a different view on these things, that they've just been invented and they're not commanded by the Bible, that's okay too. Yeah, they're not necessary for us to celebrate them, except every day we need to praise God for the birth of Jesus Christ, the life of Jesus Christ, the death and resurrection of Jesus, and celebrate as well. Jesus ascended. He is reigning from on high, and he will return to take his people home. Let's remember those things. One more thing that we need to celebrate every day, or praise God for every day, is that he has sent his Holy Spirit, and his Holy Spirit indwells us so that we can live the Christian life, because we can't do it. We're trusting him. We're trusting him to do it through us. Any other thoughts, CJ? I don't want to wrap this up hurriedly, but we have covered a lot of ground, and I hope we haven't lost people along the way, because I know my brain jumps around a little bit, because there's issues underneath the issues that we're talking about that we need to deal with. Because when you're talking to people who want to challenge these things, particularly the unsaved, they will jump around. So be prepared for that. There's a lot of goal shifting that they love to do.
Yeah, and I'll say, just for the end of it, as Graham was saying, these are issues that we are free to disagree on as far as the celebration, right? Obviously, we shouldn't be disagreeing as far as the facts, just because it's not good to be against truth. But as far as the celebration, absolutely. Paul says, let each man be convinced in his own mind. Paul also says, let no man judge you in holy days or festivals. So I think that it's important that we do live and let live in that regard. I also totally agree with Brother Graham in that we should not be celebrating anything associated with paganism. Saturnalia is literally Mardi Gras in the ancient world. And so if there was a link from Christmas to Saturnalia, then Christmas would be bad and we should not celebrate it. But the good news is, in that particular regard, there isn't, right? And the last thing that I want to say is just to agree that every single day is a day to remember Jesus Christ died for your sins and rose on the third day. Every single day is a day to remember that God was born, which is an absolutely unbelievable statement to make. The eternal creator of the universe was born at a point in time, right? Of course, that's not the whole story. He is eternal, but that's what makes it such an amazing thing, right? Is that he is eternal and yet was also born at a point in time. We should always be remembering these things. And you know, any of the other holidays you celebrate too. I like to celebrate Halloween for what it's actually for. But as far as remembering the martyrs and, you know, thanking the Lord for your own religious freedom, as far as Reformation Day, that's a daily thing, isn't it? Every single day, every single day. So, you know, the holidays are great, but if they're not something that you would be celebrating every single day, then perhaps that's the greater issue, right?
So can we quickly talk about Halloween? I was going to wrap up, but you've mentioned Halloween. It's like, oh yeah, we do need to talk about that, because it was always in my mind that Halloween was pagan. But your research shows that it wasn't originally pagan. It was originally a Christian festival remembering the martyrs.
That is correct. So, the original holiday of Halloween, first off, it's important to note that when this first started, it was multiple days because each individual area had an individual martyr that was impactful to them, right? So certain martyrs would be celebrated on, you know, you'd have the 28th of June and the 17th of November and every other day on the list. But eventually what ended up happening is there was so many martyrs that everybody was celebrating basically every single, well, not really celebrating, it's more memorializing at this point. It was a solemn kind of feast, right? But memorializing every single day on the calendar because people are just being slaughtered in mass all the time, right? And so what ended up happening is they all, and we, by the way, our earliest evidence of this collection comes from slightly after the Council of Nicaea from John Chrysostom, but he's referencing a time before the Council of Nicaea. So if we can take his history as accurate, then this holiday is another pre-Nicene holiday, meaning very great antiquity. But what ended up happening is they had so many different days that they were honoring martyrs that they just decided to put them all together in one single day and honor the martyrs, meaning all of them, right? And this ended up being a day. Originally, it was actually in the springtime. It appears to have left the springtime because the Catholic Church started associating this particular day with Mariology. And so that's why we get our move to the fall. A lot of people say the move to the fall happened because of Samhain, which is a pagan festival that takes place on November the 1st. Not accurate. The real reason for the moving of the feast is that when it originally was, March 25th, is now the festival for the Annunciation of Mary, right? And people wanted to distance themselves from that holiday. And so Halloween changed its date, which, by the way, I'm actually all on board with the ancient Christians there. I don't want anything to do with the Annunciation of Mary either, right? So that's how that ended up getting established. Now, there are elements of modern Halloween that have bled in from paganism, but they're not what you think, actually. For example, jack-o'-lanterns, actually, it used to be just a common practice for ancient people to decorate their homes with carved turnips. This is a Christian or a pre-Christian practice, but not a pagan practice. It's just a practice in which people were, doing this to decorate their homes, much the same way that you might use flowers to decorate your homes. Well, of course, that predates Christians, but it's just because it's something that people do, right? Trick-or-treating, believe it or not, is a specifically Christian tradition. Back in the really ancient times, before the 500s, children would dress up as martyrs, and that would be kind of a way to honor whichever particular martyr was impactful to your particular community, right? So you dress up in like a little St. Nicholas costume, and it'd be like actual St. Nicholas, not Santa Claus, but you know what I mean? And it would just be like a way to honor him. And then people would ask, oh, well, who are you dressed up as? And you'd tell the story of St. Nicholas and how he gave the young women, it is a famous story, he gave these young women who were very poor a dowry so that they wouldn't be sold into prostitution. And another kind of stuff like that, right? And then after they would tell the story of the feast, or of the saint, excuse me, they would be given like little treats, like usually pastries. It wasn't candy, but nonetheless. And that's where the tradition of trick or treating comes from. The things that actually come from paganism in regards to Halloween are all the obvious ones that you already knew about, like witches and you know what I mean, and the honoring of serial killers and stuff like that. And you could argue whether or not that's even necessarily pagan per se, as far as like it's certainly not Christian, but it wasn't like a religious practice of pagans, right? But the interesting thing about that is, of course, that's the ones we already knew about, right? Everybody is fully aware that the idea of like excuse my French, but like slutty zombies and stuff like that. We were already aware that stuff wasn't Christian. Nobody needs to tell us the history of it, right? But when it comes to the actual practices, this was a holiday that was actually, like I said, great antiquity. According to John Chrysostom, it was established before the Council of Nicaea, and the point was to honor those martyrs who had died during the various persecutions like Diocletian persecution and Neronic persecution and all these other persecutions where Christians were just slaughtered all the time in mass. Something that really, us Western Christians don't really have like any grasp on, you know what I mean? Just how common it really was for this kind of stuff to occur, right? And yeah, so that's the sort of, in a nutshell, history of Halloween. We'll have a full in-depth explanation of that, of course, when Halloween rolls around, Lord willing. But yeah, that's the sort of nutshell stuff for it. And if you have any other questions on it, definitely do ask, because I do have plenty of time to answer.
So two other things that I'd like to connect to Halloween, and this is just two other things that we need to remember as Christians that occurred on this date, the 31st of October. So one is from, I believe it was 1917, towards the end of, or more than halfway through World War One. The Australian Light Horse, and as an Australian, I'm more prepared to promote this, but I think Christians generally need to understand this as part of God's history and in fulfilling prophecy for Israel. The Australian Light Horse, about 800 Australians on horses, the last major cavalry charge on horses in human history. They charged Beersheba in what is now Israel, or that area, to challenge the Ottomans, and the Germans were encamped there, who were on the other side in World War One. And it led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The British took over the land that was called Palestine, still called Palestine today, but is what we would call Israel, or at least that region. And this then led to the British starting to think about setting up a Jewish state in that area. So you can look that history up. The charge of the Light Brigade, I think it's referred to. It was on the 31st of October, I believe, 1917. One other event that CJ's already mentioned, Martin Luther pinned his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg on the 31st of October. I don't remember the year, 15 something, I think. Yeah. And I think that's a good reason to remember the 31st of October and get away from the paganism that Halloween has become. And if we can try to take All Hallows Eve, I think we shouldn't call it Halloween because of how pagan Halloween has become. Let's get back to remembering the martyrs and glorifying God that he counts us worthy to suffer for his sake, as the apostles said when they were whipped, beaten, I think it says actually in the King James, because they continued to preach the gospel. We in the West particularly need to remember that being a Christian isn't always as easy in a physical sense. And in fact, it is common through most of history, through most of the world, even in most times in history, it is common for physical torture, for loss of home, family, livelihood, poverty, prison, and even death is common for Christians. And sure, 31st of October, let's remember that. Once again, you don't have to remember it as that. Remember it every day. And pray for the persecuted church. Just on this issue of the persecuted church, I always like to remind people that those who are being tortured for their faith, people in China, pray for us in the West. They consider the persecution that we experience, the more subtle social persecution, the constant mental manipulation, the constant trying to subtly tempt us to move one step away from the truth and get on the slippery slope. They pray for us and they say, oh, that'd be so difficult because it's not clear for us, where it's very clear for them. You either serve Jesus and you're tortured. There's no middle ground, whereas we've got acres of middle ground that we have to be concerned about as Western Christians, although that's slowly changing. And one day I suspect if Jesus tarries, it will be like that for us as well. We will need to be prepared to lose everything. But as Christians, we should be prepared for that now. Christ is all, and we should not compromise on anything. Any more final closing thoughts, CJ? I've already.
I'll just finish with saying, remember to continue to do these kinds of studies when it comes to these issues, because this is common, as we referenced earlier, right? It's symbols and it's holidays and it's certain dates and it's, motifs in our Bible and stuff like that. Everybody wants to claim everything on the entire planet is evil so long as we do it. And it's just a way to try and catch you up. And so if you want to be, engaged in this, you could just ignore it. But if you want to be engaged in it, then definitely do the proper research. The evidence does exist. And, sometimes our traditions do have to be set off to the side, but, when that happens, then we do that. And when it's not necessary, then we defend what it is that we do correctly.
Yeah, and I appreciate all the people that are listening. It is important to be engaged in this. It's important to be studying. It's important to be learning, and to be better soldiers of Jesus Christ. We are in a war. Our war is not physical. Our war is spiritual. And to engage in this war means we need to be engaged in the intellectual war that's going on, but it is not first an intellectual war, it's a spiritual war. So I appreciate that people are here wanting to know about this. I appreciate the work that you do, CJ, and others that are engaged in this. And I pray that we continue to fight the good fight of faith. Jesus Christ is all. He is the Savior. He is Lord. Let's make sure that we worship him with every aspect of our lives as God is leading us to. Let's be obedient to God's commands to us. Thanks for joining me, CJ.
And thank you for having me.
And thanks everyone else for being here. God bless you all. Catch you next time.